component here that represents a course editor, so a JavaScript, and we'll call this the course editor component. And in here, we might have import React, and presumably we might have represented the module as a list of modules, right? So we have li module 1, just a couple modules in there. And so we want to encapsulate, or wrap this inside of a reusable component, right? And says, there might be, the logic here might be fairly complex, right? We have to iterate, maybe each line item, each module might be represented by a whole bunch of buttons and input fields where you can edit, right? And you want to encapsulate all this in here. And so we can do that. We can encapsulate that abstraction, create that abstraction by wrapping this inside of a function. This is the course editor right now, course editor component that renders the following content: modules on the left-hand side, topics on the right-hand side, lessons and whatnot. Yes. So let's right now export this to default the course editor, right? And now in the course manager, we can now bring that in and maybe put it somewhere in here, perhaps up here, the course editor component. There it is. Now, if we render it and look at it, how it renders, there it is. We have the module over here, all the modules. Maybe it should have a title. Maybe the course manager course editor should have a title. Maybe we can wrap this inside of a div. And this might be H3 course editor, which has these modules on the left-hand side. Maybe has the topics, the lessons on the right-hand side. Right, so might have the lessons, modules and lessons, and down below you might have topics, right? And down below you might have widgets, and as you start working on this, you started to say, oh, wait a minute, this is way too much, right? This is getting way out of hand, and you might say, perhaps I might want to group this entire logic of how to render this and whatnot, and handle the adding a module, removing a module. Ideally, I could move that into another abstraction, and I can create a separate component, and then I'd break it out, and then say, well, I can put that into a module list component, and in that module list component, I can grab that and then move it over, right, and then encapsulate it in a reusable component, so I can bring it into the previous one. So I can do const module list component, give it a name, and then I can then reuse it. I can export it, right? And here I can now bring it back in as a module list component, right? So I've abstracted it, right? And it renders the same way. Yes, it renders identical, but now I don't have to think about the details. Right? I can think about it at a higher level of abstraction, right? Also, it like any level, any mechanism of abstraction, it also typically provides a mechanism of parameterization, right? That I can pass in arguments so that it can be parameterized. So I can pass in, for instance, an array of modules, where each object might represent a particular module, right? That it have maybe an ID and then the title of the module. So CSS, you may have multiple modules here, HTML, React, and different IDs, right? So I can parameterize my representation, right? So I can pass in, and then I can receive that as arguments from outside, right? Which I can then use to dynamically render this. You can say, grab the modules, iterate over them, and as you iterate, grab me each module, and for each module, render an LI, whose content is the module.title. right? And whose primary key is the module._id, right? Having done that, notice that now I not only have the hard-coded values 1, 2, 3, I now have the dynamic parameterized values that I'm passing in as arguments, right? So I no longer need this, this hard-coded stuff. Obviously, if I want to read it a little better, maybe I want to break this out, right? Now, the same decision that we made of deciding that the modulus components, right, those LIs were too much to leave here. We might that same decision of breaking it out into a separate component. You might make the same decision again for this LI. Because this LI might contain input fields, edit buttons, save buttons, delete buttons, right? Might have highlights and whatnot. It might have hovers. So you might decide that perhaps, again, this might be better encapsulated in a module list item, right? Because it has way too many things in there. Right? Again, it's up to you what level of granularity, right, or how coarse your tree, right, should be, right? So it depends also on your team. Some teams have very, very shallow components. Some teams have very deep components. So it depends on your team and how to design it, right? Obviously the more abstraction, there's at some point there's a low gain, right? The more components you create, right, the much harder it is to maintain them, right? You have to maintain all these components then, right? So it makes sense, right? That's the intent of React, right? Being able to break up your content into reusable components and whatnot.